Hi everyone, this is a video I have been planning to do for a long time and just not had the time to do it, so I'm going to try and see if I can quickly go through these. So like many of my other sample books, this was one that I did on acrylic paint effects, and some of them were just trial and error, experimenting with paint to see what you can do. This has become an excellent teaching resource. As you can see, it was actually bound together as a flip book, but I have since made a number of other samples, so I've added to it. So I'm just going to go through them quickly, and I hope that this helps you, and I hope that you can go on to experiment and try your own painting samples as well. So on this first one, as you can see here, it says marks are made in pen or pencil and they show through thin paint. Or you can make the marks on top of the dried paint, obviously. So that's just showing ways in which you can add marks. I've just written on it, but that could apply to drawing or making any sort of marks. If you're using various different types of brushes, then you're going to get different sizes. Using brushes of various sizes and shapes and bristles, natural and synthetic. I was able to write my name with a thin brush. You can make thin marks, making marks with a fan brush. And I use this a lot in my painting to do trees. So you can create different textures and marks based obviously on the different brushes you're using. You can blend colors or tones. And in this case, I'm just making smooth, long horizontal streaks. Works really nice for skies and flat areas or water. Here I'm starting to add physical texture or having a tactile painting. So for this one, I mixed sawdust, but you could do the same thing with sand. And I believe I have another sample somewhere with sand mixed into it as well. This one I was experimenting with adding PVA glue, the regular white glue that we use in class, and just adding paint with the glue, making it kind of thick and globby. I found that it caused the paint to not spread evenly, excuse me, but that actually made really nice effects. So you've got some areas that are thick and some areas that are thin. Another tactile one. For this one, I have added tissue paper onto the surface and then painted on top of that. And my students use this a lot when you want to create textures, possibly in a landscape with mountains and so on. It works really well. This one I have used a lot back in the day when I was doing my spacescapes. So for this, I've actually painted a dark blue background, and to get this galaxy effect, I sprayed it with an adhesive spray glue and then just dusted it with chalk on top. Another one that I've mixed with chalk, this was actually white paint, and while the paint was wet, I scraped chalk pastels onto it and then brushed it in. So I've added my own color to the paint, and then as it was drying, I've sprinkled some more chalk dust on it, and that's dried and set in it, and that's created a really nice effect there. I think this would work really well if you want to get a basket texture, something that's woven, or for fabrics. So I'm just using a watered down paint, painting diagonally and then going across. So basically a cross hatching with nice light brush strokes. Here I'm using a different applicator. I'm using a sponge. So a piece of paper stuck onto it there. So I'm using a sponge in this case to create more of an implied texture, as it says. So I'm not creating a physical texture, but just implying a texture by using a sponge. And similar to the smooth blending, this one I'm just blending it in swirls. And I've done a paint effect there that kind of works with my spacescapes, you know, like you're looking out into space, galaxies, and then it's splattered on top with paint from a toothbrush. Many people will be familiar with doing resist in your paint. In this case, I use wax resist, so I just use a candle to rub onto the surface and then paint it over it with a very thin paint. And because it's a water-based paint, that wax from the candle causes a resist and you're able to get white areas showing through. In this case, I applied PVA glue again, as my notes say there. Just drizzled it on the surface, left it to dry, and then painted on top of it. I quite like that effect. It's almost as if water splashed or dripped onto the surface, and then it's created this nice physical texture. Once I painted onto it, I wiped some of the excess paint away, so it's a very thin coat of paint. Here is just using tissue paper. So this is tissue paper that I think it came in a gift bag or a shoebox, to something with a pattern on it, and I've applied a thin coat of paint on top. I ripped the edge of the tissue paper there so you could actually see the paper that I was working with. And there's areas where the paint is darker and the pattern is hidden, and areas where it's thinner and you can see it. This one I'm just using the acrylic paint really thick, so I've used reds and oranges and blended them from one to the other, creating a physical texture here by basically just daubing it onto the surface with my paintbrush. And for this one, I was now moving into looking at a style of art. So I'm no longer just applying the paint in different ways, but trying to see what I can create. So doing pointillism in this case, and you notice that this sample is actually upside down, where all the others have the writing at the bottom. This one ended up at the top. It was a last minute thing that I decided to just stick in. So this was the first set of paint samples that was my original book. And since then, I have gone on to do a number of other samples. I have yet to put these back into a book, but I do still use them in class. It's fun to hand these out into class and the students can get to examine them physically and look at them. So for this one, I'm sure there's an actual name for this technique. I can't think of it right now, but I just use a palette knife to apply the paint really, really thickly. And obviously that's going to take a while to dry, but you can see the nice thick texture created there. There's areas where the blue and the green is kind of blended in and it's more of an impressionist style painting. And then the flowers can be seen a little bit clearer at the top. So this is the other one I was talking about with the tactile texture being created. Here I've added sand. So similar to the one I had previously with the sawdust, I've added sand into this one. And here I actually mix the sand in with the paint. So obviously you can create the texture first and then paint on top of it if you so desire, or you can actually make the paint itself textured, in this case where I added a sand. For this I was applying texture to the surface. I've used a piece of kind of gauzy type fabric that frays easily, glued that down there, and then pulled out strings and threads and glued them down as well. And then when that was dry and stuck to the surface, I painted over it. These are really good techniques for mixed media work. So if you're a person who does mixed media painting or mixed media journals, these are excellent to add into your work to create physical texture in your painting or on your backgrounds. I had fun doing this one. It's just bits of newspaper. So in this instance, I cut up the newspaper. In fact, I think the one below it is actually the one I did first. So here I ripped up newspaper. This is used a lot in mixed media painting to create a nice background. So it's ripped up newspaper, glued to the surface, and then you're painting on it. So you're able to see that print coming through just slightly. And then from that, I decided to try cutting it up. So as you can see, I've faded it across. So on this side, I cut up the newspaper, glued them down really, really close together. And as I came across, I got more scattered with the pieces and then painted on top of that once it was dry. Once you start doing this type of work, obviously it's going to lead you into experimenting with other things. So I found this on a jewelry making site where somebody was using eggshells, and I thought, why not? You see how glittery and shiny that is? That's because it's not just acrylic paint, but I actually have nail polish on this as well. So I have crushed eggshells, clean eggshells, glue them down to the surface. There's areas here in the background where the glue actually caused the paint to separate, but still an interesting technique. If I bring that in a bit closer, you can see it there. And then when I wanted to highlight areas of the eggshells, I used blue nail polish to highlight those. Here I started to create my own textures by making my own modeling paste. Now this was made by mixing white acrylic paint with baby powder and glue, with body powder and glue. And it makes a really nice modeling paste. Of course, it's a lot cheaper than going and buying the ones at the store. I found that as it dried in places, it did crack, and that might have just had to do with the percentages of my mixtures. But it worked. In this case, I put it through a stencil. And in this case, I just kind of plastered it all over the surface. So you can see the texture that's created there. I really like this. And I think I would definitely use this in the background of a painting. So I basically just created a texture. Now if you thin out that modeling paste, mixture of white acrylic paint, body powder and glue, if you do that thinner, it also makes a really good gesso. So there you go. Here I'm using found materials. I've used corrugated cardboard, bubble wrap and bottle tops to print onto the surface to create some interesting backgrounds there as well. Now these two, I'm just going to put them side by side, shift that over a little bit. These two are quite similar. So what I've done here is I have applied paint to the surface, in this case just blending it from blue to green, and then I used a crush paper, just a piece of printer paper, crushed it up, and while the paint was still wet, just basically did that with it. So I picked up some of the paint off the surface, and in this case I did the same thing but using a plastic bag, and I actually picked up that technique from a student at school who used that technique on her ceramics work. So there you go, teachers learn from students too. Now as I move this, you'll see that one side is a bit shiny. I applied an acrylic varnish on top as well. So just a few more to go. For this one I masked off different areas. It's almost like doing batik, it's a form of resist, but basically I was using masking tape. So you know we'd normally put masking tape all the way around your painting to create a nice white border. But what I did was rip up bits of masking tape, glued it to the surface, taped it down to the surface. I painted it in a really light green color. And then once those were dry, peeled up all the bits of masking tape and then ripped up other bits and put it down in different places, did it in a slightly darker green, repeated the process with a darker color. So this took some time, it works in layers, but I really like that effect. It's worth experimenting. Now these last ones, I believe I have another video that actually shows some of these. These last one, I've used a thin wash of paint applied directly to the paper and then just sprinkled it with table salt. So there's a little bit of an effect, but it doesn't show up a lot. It shows up a lot better when I gessoed the surface first. So both of these are just applying regular table salt, but if you have a gesso on the surface, it just blocks out the paint from soaking into the paper and allows it to spread. And here I was using alcohol. So I've rubbing alcohol, painted the surface with a thin layer of gesso first, and that's my homemade gesso as I was talking about before. Thin layer of blue paint was applied, allowed to dry, and then a thin layer of yellow was applied on top, and then I've dropped rubbing alcohol on top, so it kind of just allowed that paint to spread out and shift and move, and you saw the colors coming through. This one should be on top. So this is the other one that was done with alcohol. This was just using one color, so this was actually the first one I did, and then I tried one with two colors. And then last of all, this effect was created by applying a primer or gesso onto the surface, and then once it was dry, covered it with water, in a very thin water, and then paint was dripped onto the very wet surface. So it's almost like watercolor painting on a wet surface, just allowing it to just bleed out. So there you go. That is an enormous amount of paint samples that I have tried, and I use these in classes, and I encourage you to go out, experiment, try your own, and see what you can come up with. Bye guys.